Hello students, I am Dr. Varsha Gawande, Head Department of English, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Amravati. Dear friends, today we are going to learn about the poem On His Blindness by John Milton. It is prescribed for semester 2 of BA First. Now when we begin, let us tell me something about John Milton and his poem. John Milton believed that he was chosen by God to be a major poet. Milton was keenly interested in contemporary political and cultural events. His poetry was greatly influenced by his Puritan faith and his broad, enlightened Renaissance outlook. By his late 40s, Milton had lost his eyesight completely. On His Blindness is perhaps Milton's most well known sonnet. The first half of the poem presents the poet's problem, where he reflects on his ardent desire to serve God and expresses frustration at his inability to do so because of his being handicapped. He worries that he did not do enough to glorify God all these days when he had his eyes. But when he lost his sight, he thought, now nothing is left more with him, and his talent will go wasted. But, dear friends, in the later half of the poem, patience reminds him that God does not need his work. God does not need your glorification, but to serve God gracefully by accepting the faith and waiting till he is called upon again is the real purpose of his life. And if he has talent, if he wants to honor God, if he wants to love God, to dedicate his sincerity, his talent to God, then there is only one thing. If he has eyes or he doesn't have his eyesight, doesn't matter. He can glorify God, he can do service to God by his greatest talent of writing poetry. And On His Blindness has thus become the greatest poem of John Milton. Actually, this poem teaches you a very good moral lesson. As I earlier said, that if you want to serve God, it is not necessary that you should have all the tools, and God expects that you should glorify Him. But if you want to serve God, serve humanity. Make the right use of your talent, no matter what the condition is. And this is the theme of today's poem, On His Blindness by John Milton. Now, this is a sonnet written by John Milton. He was an acclaimed 17th century English poet. As I told you before, as a sonneteer, Milton widened the range of the sonnet and revived the classical or the Petrarchan sonnet from falling into parts. The first, an octave, is of 8 lines, rhyming A B B A A B B A. It reveals the poet's fear and complaints. And the second is a sestet, 6 lines, rhyming CDE, CDE, which teaches us total submission to God's design. Now, this poem is also known as When I Consider How My Light is Spent. It starts from this line. The poem opens by light. Now, this poem was written in 1655, 3 years after Milton became completely blind. As I have told you before, that after 40s, Milton had lost his eyesight and was marked by a brooding sense of despondency arising out of his blindness. Now you imagine, till today, now at present, you are able to see everything. And suddenly, when you get up in the morning, the next day, you don't have eyesight. You are unable to see this world. How you will feel? And so you can relate your condition or your emotions and feelings with Milton. So, after 40s, when Milton lost his eyesight, during this time, this poem has come into his writings. It was written when Milton won in it, and so I am saying that this poem was written when Milton was in his 44th year. The poem can be divided into two parts. As you can feel his condition in the first half of the poem, he expresses his sadness at the loss of his eyesight. And in the second part, he then realizes that he can use his talent even though he doesn't have his eyesight. Because serving God means serving his talent given by him or bestowed upon him by God. He finds himself alone in this dark and wide world. When suddenly he loses his eyesight, of course, he finds that his world has become dark. God has given him the talent of writing poetry, is the gift. And this gift is lying useless within. Why? Because now, since he cannot see, he thinks he is unable to write any type of poetry. He is expressing his unhappiness about the fact that the best part of his life would go waste without producing any work of creative importance. It is like death for him to hide his talent. He fears that he finds himself alone in this dark and wide world. God has given him the talent of writing poetry. And now, why he took away his eyesight, without which he thinks in the beginning that he is unable to use his talent. This gift is lying useless within. So he feels. He is expressing his unhappiness about the fact that the best part of his life would go waste without producing his creative talent or without producing any poetry. It is like death for him to hide his talent. He fears that God will rebuke him for not using his talent because he wants to serve God with this gift, the gift of writing poetry. He grumbles against God and he thus raises the question of the justness of God's ways to man in relation to his own loss of sight. Now, how justness means being just, being fair. If God has provided him the talent, if God has bestowed upon him the talent, then why do God take away his eyesight? Now, how he is able to write poetry? And so he questions about the justness, the fairness, the fair judgment of God. He foolishly asks himself whether God demands work from him, although God has made him blind, or again a question mark in front of him. Thus, the first half of the poem reflects the poet's mood of sadness, and his life would go waste without producing any work of creative importance. And now, as I said, that this poem is divided into two parts. So, this was the first part. And so, in the first part, he always thinks like it is like death for him to hide his talent. He fears that God will rebuke him for not using his talent. He grumbles against God. He raises the question of justness, of God's ways. He foolishly asks himself and demands work from him being blind and how he could do his creative work. Thus, first half of the poem is about sadness and murmur. And now, when we go forward in the second part of the poem, this is very important. And this second part gives us a moral lesson for every reader, for every human. What is the second part? The second part of the poem, however, in the poem, it expresses Milton's feeling of resignation and his undiminished faith in God's justice. So finally, friends, he realizes that God's ways are always just, his judgments are always fair. He accepts total submission to the will of God. He has complete faith in God in the second half of the poem. And he says that whatever God does, does for the best. And so he submits himself to God's judgment. The poet's inner faith consoles him, and thus his murmur stops. He realizes that God does not need anyone's praise or work. God doesn't demand any glorification from you. And so, those who bear the duties given by God serve Him best. God only wants complete faith in Him. Those who patiently serve God and wait for His orders are also His true servants. The sonnet teaches us to be content with our lot in life, and also that it is man's duty to stand in readiness to serve God without any complaint or protest. So, the moral of the poem is that whatever God has given to you, you should be content with it. You should be satisfied. And there are means and ways to serve God. And the best way is to be sincere with your efforts, to be sincere with the talents bestowed upon you by God, ingrained in you by birth, and mainly serve humanity. That is the best way to serve God. So, dear friends, now I think it's very easy to understand the moral of this poem, but it will be more nice if you implement it in your life. Be content with what you have got, whatever faith you have faith in God, and be sincere in your efforts to serve humanity, because serving humanity means serving God. Using your talents in right way means serving God. This is the moral of the poem on his blindness. Thank you so much. Thank you.